A quiet town in England was rocked by fear, a killer with a chilling plan, and Poirot was their only hope. The small, misty town of Arkham-on-Sea sat in eerie silence, veiled by the thick fog that rolled in from the sea. Its streets, normally bustling with quiet, everyday life, were now a maze of shadows. The air felt colder than usual, as if the very town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dark to emerge from the depths. It had been years since anything truly unsettling had happened here, but tonight, something had shifted. Inside a quaint, unassuming shop on the edge of town, the body of Alice Asher was discovered. The scene was chilling. Alice, a well-known figure in the town, was sprawled on the floor behind her counter, her lifeless form frozen in a grim stillness. Her eyes were wide open, an expression of sheer terror painted across her face. A pale hand clutched a folded piece of paper, tightly gripping it, as though it were her last desperate connection to someone. The note, now damp with the early morning dew, was unlike anything the officers had seen before. In bold, precise handwriting, the message simply read, ABC. The police were stumped. No signs of struggle, no apparent motive, just a dead woman, a cryptic note, and a town that could barely comprehend the horror that had befallen them. Inspector Japp of the local force scratched his head, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration as he ordered the scene sealed off. But as he and his team searched the shop for clues, there was no trail to follow, no fingerprints, no strange footprints, not even a hint of who could have committed such an act. As the town whispered nervously about the death, none could have predicted the next turn of events. Hours later, at his office in London, Hercule Poirot sat in his chair, staring at the freshly arrived letter that had just been delivered to him. His sharp eyes skimmed the paper, then narrowed with intense focus. The letter, written in the same flawless script, bore no return address, but the words it contained chilled him to his core. "This is just the beginning, my dear Poirot. I have planned it every name, every letter, in perfect order. The town of Arkham-on-Sea is the stage, and this, the first scene. It will be an A, then a B, and then the next. Wait and watch, for the game has already begun." The letter ended with a final, unsettling line. "ABC will haunt them all." Poirot leaned back in his chair, the weight of the message sinking in. His mind, ever sharp, began to churn, analyzing every detail with perfect precision. He had faced murder before, but something about this felt different, personal, sinister. The killer's arrogance was palpable, and yet there was a sense of calculation beneath the madness. This was no ordinary case. The initial puzzle, the cryptic letters, the lack of any clear suspects was only the surface. Poirot could feel the shadows moving, slipping through the cracks of this seemingly peaceful town. This was not a simple murder, this was a plan, and it had only just begun. The town's tranquility would soon be shattered, and the alphabet would become the killer's twisted map. Poirot's lips tightened into a grim smile, and as he folded the letter, his voice broke the silence. "This will be a case like no other." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promise. What lay ahead was far darker than anyone could imagine, and Poirot was already racing against time to stop it. Cliffhanger. What twisted game had the killer set in motion, and what chilling revelations would each letter bring? The investigation begins. The train chugged into Arkham-on-Sea with a hiss of steam, shrouded in the thick fog that seemed to grip the town in a vice. Hercule Poirot stepped off with his customary precision, his black hat perched perfectly atop his head, his sharp eyes scanning the fog-covered landscape. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a quiet, peaceful English town, the kind where nothing ever changed. But Poirot knew better. He felt the weight of the case pressing on him the moment he stepped off the train. The air was thick, but it wasn't just the fog that hung heavy in the atmosphere. It was the presence of something far darker, something unseen but very real. Poirot made his way towards the local police station, his footsteps steady, unwavering. Inside, Inspector Japp was already at work, his face a portrait of frustration. The case had stumped the entire force, and the arrival of Poirot only added to his growing irritation. Japp's dismissive glance said it all, but Poirot remained calm, his mind already turning over the small details. "You've come to gloat, Poirot," Japp sneered, the skepticism in his voice clear. "I am here to assist, mon ami," Poirot replied smoothly, his accent as polished as ever. "I see in your eyes the uncertainty that this case has brought upon you. Tell me what has happened here. I am intrigued." Japp grumbled, but he led Poirot to the shop where Alice Asher's body had been discovered. The scene was still fresh in everyone's mind. Poirot walked through the small, cluttered shop, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced ease. His eyes narrowed as they landed on the faint imprint left by Alice's hand, still gripping the note. The initials ABC stood out like a challenge, one that Poirot could not ignore. There was something deeply personal about the crime. He could feel it. This wasn't just about a murder. It was something more. He turned to Japp. "You see, Inspector, it is not just the victim who matters here. It is the way she died. The fear in her eyes, it is not accidental. No, there is something behind this. Something that connects her to the next in line." Japp's brow furrowed. "What are you on about, Poirot? A simple murder. A woman who got caught up in something she shouldn't have." But Poirot's mind was already working, unraveling the threads that tied Alice Asher's death to something far more sinister. As he scanned the scene, his mind reached into the past, pulling up every tiny detail that might lead him to an answer. The strange initial ABC wasn't just a clue, it was a signature. A sign of something bigger, something calculated. Poirot looked at the note one more time before he spoke again. "It is clear to me now, mon ami. Alice Asher was not the first, and she will not be the last." Japp stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "What are you talking about?" "Here is no connection, Poirot." "Ah, but there is," Poirot said, turning to walk back out of the shop. "And I shall find it." As the days wore on, Poirot's investigation led him deeper into the mystery, and strange coincidences began to emerge. The victims were not just connected by their names, but by something darker, something hidden in their pasts. Alice Asher, Betty Barnard, both had something in common, something they had no idea they were tied to until the killings began. Each woman had been involved, directly or indirectly, in a scandalous event from the town's Historia scandal that no one spoke of, but one that had shaped the very fabric of this town. The letters, Poirot realized, were not random at all. They were part of a much larger design, a twisted pattern that had been set into motion long before Alice had died. Poirot's mind raced as he uncovered more. He connected Betty Barnard's troubled past to the mysterious letter B. And then C, the next name was already in his head. And yet, no matter how many steps ahead he seemed to be, the killer always stayed one step further. Whoever this murderer was, they were as meticulous as Poirot himself. The pattern, the sequence, they weren't just aiming for random victims. No, the killer had a message, a reason for each life claimed, and Poirot could feel that he was getting closer to understanding the twisted logic. But the deeper he dug, the more resistance he encountered from the local authorities. Japp, still unwilling to accept Poirot's involvement, dismissed his theories as eccentric, as he often did with outsiders. The inspector's dismissive attitude only fueled Poirot's determination. There was no time to waste, and no one, not even Japp, was going to stop him from solving this. Poirot. Japp grumbled one afternoon as they stood outside the town's old church. "You've got your theories, but this isn't some game. People are dying, and you are too busy playing detective to even see it." Poirot paused, his back straight, his voice calm and unwavering. "Ah, Inspector, you are right about one thing. This is not a game, but it is a puzzle. And puzzles, as you know, require patience, observation, and a great deal of understanding." He locked eyes with Japp. "This is a matter of life and death, mon ami. I shall solve it, You shall see. Just as Poirot's investigation seemed to gain ground, a new twist struck an unexpected lead that sent him spiraling down a dangerous path. It became clear that this wasn't just a series of random killings. The killer had an agenda, a personal vendetta that was far deeper than Poirot had anticipated. And the next victim, well, the clock was ticking. Cliffhanger. As Poirot finally pieces together the chilling connection between the victims, a shocking discovery emerges: a victim who was supposed to be the next target has already disappeared. The killer's reach is wider than anyone realized, and Poirot is running out of time. The suspects. The fog had not lifted, nor had the mystery surrounding Arcamon-C. It was now clear to Hercule Poirot that the murders were not just connected by the victims' names, but by the chilling pattern that each crime scene revealed. His mind buzzed as he walked the streets of the town, piecing together the puzzle, one dark detail at a time. The deaths of Alice Asher and Betty Barnard were only the beginning of a much larger, more sinister plot. Poirot stood in front of the quiet, unassuming shop where Alice Asher had met her untimely death. As he examined the scene again, he realized that the way the victims had been killed held a hidden message, a coded language that the killer had left for him. Each detail, the positioning of the bodies, the placement of the note, the subtle signs that others had missed, was a key. This wasn't random. No, it was all part of a grander design, a methodical mind at work. He turned to Inspector Japp, who had reluctantly been following Poirot's investigation, trying to keep up with the detective's sharp deductions. "Look here, mon ami," Poirot said, his fingers gently tracing the edges of the note left behind by Alice. "Each crime scene gives us a clue that leads to the next. The order, the symbols, even the very way the body is found. It's a language that speaks of something greater, something deliberate." Japp, still grappling with Poirot's brilliance, frowned. "So, you are saying the killer is leaving a trail we can follow?" Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Exactly. But the question is not just who will be next, it is why they are being chosen in the first place." The first suspect Poirot focused on was Lisa Asher, Alice's only daughter. She was a woman in mourning, her grief palpable as she stood in the quiet of her mother's shop, her face hidden behind the veil of sorrow. Yet Poirot could not ignore the undercurrent of something darker in her. A whisper of something that didn't quite add up. She was a grieving daughter, yes, but was that all she was? Poirot observed her closely as she tried to carry on with the mundane details of her life, though her every movement seemed forced, as if she were acting in a play she never wanted to star in. The town's dark history had followed Lisa like a shadow, lingering just behind her every step. She was connected to the town's murky past, a past that Poirot was only beginning to unravel. "Lisa Asher, tell me," Poirot asked gently, his voice smooth, like a predator luring in its prey. "Have you ever heard of the events that took place here many years ago? The things that the townspeople try to forget? Or perhaps, are you trying to forget them yourself?" Lisa stiffened at his words, her eyes momentarily betraying the mask she wore. "I have nothing to say about that." Poirot could see at the faintest trace of fear that flickered in her eyes. There was a secret here, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. Her connection to the town's dark past was no coincidence. But did she know more than she was letting on? Or was she merely another pawn in the killer's grand game? Next, Poirot turned his attention to Tom Barnard, Betty's ex-boyfriend. A volatile man, known for his fiery temper and history of violent behavior, Tom seemed like an obvious suspect. He had a motive: anger, jealousy, perhaps revenge. Poirot met him at a local pub, where Tom was drowning his sorrows in alcohol, his rough hands trembling slightly as he clutched the glass. "I didn't kill Betty," Tom spat, his voice raw with emotion. "But I wish I could have. She was a liar, a cheat. You don't know what she did to me." Poirot didn't flinch. "Tell me, Tom, what happened between you and Betty? Why this anger, this hatred?" Tom's face twisted with rage, but as quickly as the fury flared, it died down, replaced with a quiet, almost sorrowful expression. "It's too late now," he muttered. "What's done is done. She's gone, and here is nothing left to say." But Poirot wasn't convinced. Tom's volatile emotions didn't seem to match the calculated nature of the murders. He was a man who acted on impulse, not a man who could mastermind such a meticulous plan. Poirot's third suspect was Samar, a local historian who had spent years studying the town's forgotten past. Samar seemed harmless enough, but his obsession with the town's murky history gave Poirot pause. He was well versed in its dark secrets, and Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that Samar knew more than he let on. When Poirot visited Samar's home, he found the man surrounded by books and old town records, his face lit by the dim glow of a desk lamp. "I study the past to understand the present," Samar explained, his voice soft and contemplative. "The past never really leaves us. It lingers, like the fog." "And what of these deaths?" Poirot asked, his eyes narrowing. "Does the past have a hand in them?" Samar's eyes flickered, but he quickly masked his reaction. "The past is full of ghosts, Poirot. It's not for me to say who they choose to haunt." Poirot's mind raced. Samar's knowledge of the town's history was far too convenient, and his evasiveness made Poirot wonder whether the historian was hiding something much darker. Just as Poirot began to draw connections between his three key suspects, something unexpected happened, something that threatened to throw his entire investigation off course. A piece of evidence was discovered that led Poirot to believe that the killer might be someone with connections to the town's criminal underworld. A taunting note, a cryptic clue, suggested that the killer was not a member of the town at all, but someone with a far more sinister background. Poirot stared at the evidence, his mind working furiously. Was the killer truly an outsider, or was this a clever red herring trap set to mislead him? Cliffhanger. As Poirot contemplates the cryptic message, a new development occurs. A letter arrives at Poirot's office with a single sentence written inside. "I have just begun." The letter D is next. The investigation deepens. Poirot sat in the dimly lit room of the small inn, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his mind. The deaths were no longer just tragic events, they were a calculated, deliberate act of revenge. The killer's obsession with the alphabet, each victim's name falling neatly into the pattern, now made a disturbing kind of sense. But Poirot knew that the pattern alone wasn't enough. He needed to understand why these people were chosen. The breakthrough came when Poirot discovered a long-buried secret from the town's pasta scandal, so dark, so hidden, that it had remained forgotten for years. His investigation led him to an old town record, yellowed with age, in the dusty corners of the town hall archives. There he uncovered the story of a forbidden love affair, a betrayal that had torn apart families and left a stain on the town's reputation. The scandal was connected to a series of powerful names, including the Asher family and Betty Barnard's ancestors. As Poirot pieced together the puzzle, he realized with a chill that the victims Alice, Betty, and the others yet to come had all unknowingly been involved in the scandal. They were linked to the very families whose secrets had been buried in the past. The killer had not just chosen their names, they had targeted them because they were the unwitting descendants of those who had betrayed or wronged the murderer's ancestors. Poirot leaned back in his chair, stunned. The letters, the sequence of murders, this was no random act of violence. This was a meticulously planned campaign of vengeance, generations in the making. The deeper Poirot delved into the investigation, the more perilous it became. The killer, it seemed, was not content with simply taking lives. No, this person was a master of manipulation, setting traps not just for the victims, but for Poirot himself. One evening, as Poirot followed a new lead into a quiet alley, the air grew thick with tension. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he pressed on, his mind focused on the next clue. Suddenly, the world seemed to tilt, and Poirot barely had time to react as the ground beneath him gave way. The alley he had been walking through was a carefully laid snare designed to lead him into a death trap. The ground crumbled away, revealing a pit lined with sharp metal spikes. He only just managed to grasp a nearby railing, pulling himself back to safety. Poirot's heart pounded as he staggered back. His composure rattled for the first time in years. The killer had made it personal. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about proving something. The stakes had escalated, and Poirot knew that he was no longer just chasing a murderer. He was being hunted. But the real shock came when Poirot discovered a chilling detail about the killer's identity, one that turned his entire world upside down. As Poirot meticulously reviewed his notes, piecing together the timeline of the murders, a sudden, terrifying realization struck him. The killer wasn't just targeting innocent townspeople. He was targeting people connected to Poirot's own past. Poirot's normally unshakable demeanor faltered as memories from his past, long buried, forgotten, came rushing back. He remembered a case he had worked on years ago, a case that had haunted him, one in which he had been unable to bring justice. It had involved betrayal, deception, and a life that had been lost. Now the murderer was targeting people who had crossed paths with Poirot during that case, and Poirot realized, with a sinking feeling, that his connection to the killer ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. The killer knew his past, and now they were making him pay for it. Cliffhanger. Poirot, shaken by the revelation, rushes to the next crime scene, desperate to stop the killer before anyone else is hurt. But when he arrives, he finds a note addressed to him, scrawled in blood on the wall. "You are next, Poirot." The final act. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder that the murderer's plan was drawing closer to its horrifying conclusion. Poirot stood in the middle of his cluttered study, surrounded by scattered notes, maps, and evident fragments of a puzzle that, until now, had refused to fit together. His mind, sharp as ever, was beginning to piece the riddle together, but the deeper he dug, the more the situation twisted, becoming darker, more dangerous. A chilling realization struck him. The killer was more than just a shadowy figure lurking in the town. They were someone far more connected to the investigation, someone close to Poirot, someone within his inner circle. The pieces of the puzzle no longer pointed outward, they pointed inward. Poirot's thoughts were a storm, each possibility more disturbing than the last. Who among his colleagues, his trusted allies, could have hidden such a dangerous secret? Was it someone he had misjudged? Someone he had trusted too much? The deeper he looked into the eyes of those around him, the more he began to question every gesture, every word. The next letter was on its way. Poirot could feel it in the air, the unease in the townspeople's eyes, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The killer was biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment. And Poirot knew that time was running out. Poirot's mind flashed back to the clues that had seemed insignificant at first, the offhand comments, the chance encounters, the mysterious figures who had appeared at the crime scenes. He thought of the quiet but persistent Samar, the local historian whose obsession with the town's past had often seemed excessive, bordering on manic. But there was something more there, something Poirot had missed. Was it possible that Samar had been hiding his own dark connection to the murders? Poirot's attention shifted to Inspector Japp, who had been increasingly distant. The inspector had always been a steady hand in the investigation, but lately he had been on edge, his behavior growing erratic. Was Japp hiding something? Was he more involved than he appeared to be? Poirot had once considered him a friend, but now doubts began to creep in. Poirot's thoughts turned to Lisa, Alice Asher's daughter, a grieving, fragile woman, but there was something unsettling about the way she had reacted to the deaths. The fear in her eyes had been real, yes, but was it possible that her grief masked something much darker? The night before the next murder, Poirot could barely sleep, his mind whirling with all the questions and suspects. The next letter would arrive soon, could feel the weight of it hanging in the air. He knew the killer's obsession with the alphabet was nearing its cruel climax, and Poirot, for the first time, felt the gnawing weight of his own vulnerability. The killer was getting closer, not just to the town's innocent residents, but to Poirot himself. As the sun set, the urgency grew. Poirot's thoughts were clouded by the creeping sense of doom, but just when it seemed like everything was closing in, Poirot's phone rang. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. "You've been chasing shadows, Poirot. The game is about to end, and you are already too late." A cold shiver ran down Poirot's spine. He rushed to the scene of the latest murder, where time seemed to slow. The house stood dark and silent, the shadows creeping around its edges. Poirot moved swiftly, his heart hammering in his chest, every step filled with an increasing sense of dread. And there, in the center of the crime scene, a body lay sprawled on the floor, a woman, the latest victim, her name scrawled on a piece of paper beside her. The killer's pattern was now clear, and Poirot knew that the next victim would follow soon, someone whose name began with E. But as Poirot knelt to examine the scene, his gaze fell upon something far more disturbing, a small blood-stained note addressed to him personally. It read, "You've been playing my game all along, Poirot. But you are just a pawn, just like the rest of them. Tomorrow it's your turn." The words were a punch to the gut. Poirot's heart pounded as he realized that the killer had been one step ahead of him the entire time, playing a game with far more deadly consequences than he could have imagined. The clock was ticking, and this time, Poirot was the one in danger. Cliffhanger. As Poirot stares at the note in his trembling hands, a shadow flickers behind him. He spins around too late. The figure vanishes into the darkness, leaving Poirot with a chilling question. Who in his inner circle has been manipulating him all along? Chase. The final race against time. The air was thick with anticipation, and Poirot could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on him. The clock was no longer just ticking. It was a drumbeat, counting down to something far darker. The killer had not only been playing with the town, but with Poirot himself, orchestrating a series of murders that were leading toward an inevitable and deadly climax. The time for theorizing was over. The game had turned into a race, and Poirot was racing against a killer who knew the town's darkest secrets. Poirot stood at the heart of the town, his sharp eyes scanning the familiar streets, now tainted with a sense of danger. The townspeople had begun to look over their shoulders, their lives shattered by the horror of the murders and the chilling letters that followed. Everyone was on edge, and no one felt safe. He knew the next victim was already chosen, and with each passing moment, he was running out of time to stop the killer. The first step was clear. Find the next target. Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities, examining every pattern, every clue. The alphabetical sequence was not just a sick game, it was a map. Every murder was a step closer to the town's core, to something much bigger and more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The killer wasn't simply targeting random victims, they were targeting the town's heart, the very thing that had kept the town alive for generations. Poirot's eyes landed on the town's central square, the oldest part of the town, where the church stood tall, casting a long shadow over the town's secrets. There was no doubt in his mind the killer's final act would take place here, in this sacred, unsuspecting space. The killer was going to strike at the very soul of the town. But who would be the next victim? Poirot's mind spun, but before he could make a move, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was low, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. "You think you can stop me, Poirot? You've been chasing shadows, but I am already there, waiting. The last letter will soon be delivered, and you'll be too late." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. The killer was closer than ever, and this time, Poirot wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. But he couldn't stop now. Not when everything had led to this moment. Poirot's instincts kicked into overdrive. He gathered his team, and they raced through the narrow streets, past the rows of ancient houses, their windows shuttered tight as if hiding from the growing darkness. Poirot's mind was sharp, but the killer was sharper, already a step ahead. Every corner turn seemed to reveal more danger, more uncertainty. It was clear now. Poirot wasn't chasing the killer, was being hunted. The townspeople had grown increasingly restless, and whispers spread like wildfire. Some feared the murderer had already infiltrated their midst, while others thought it was someone from outside, someone who had been watching them for years. But Poirot had a different theory, a theory that sent a chill down his spine. As he passed the local pub, Poirot caught sight of a figure in the distance, a silhouette standing in the shadows. His heart raced as he recognized the familiar outline. Samar, the town historian. Was he the one behind all of this? Had he been hiding in plain sight all along? Poirot's instincts screamed at him to confront Samar, but before he could act, the man vanished into the night, his figure dissolving into the thick fog that had rolled in from the sea. Poirot paused, his mind spinning. Had it all been a ploy to draw him away? Was Samar truly involved, or had he been manipulated into playing a part in the killer's twisted game? Then came the call that turned everything on its head. "Poirot," the voice whispered urgently. "The church, the bell tower. It's where it all ends. You must come quickly before it's too late." Without another word, Poirot surged into action, his legs carrying him faster than ever before. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he raced toward the church, his heart pounding in his chest. Time was slipping through his fingers like sand. The church stood ominously against the misty sky, its bell tower looming like a dark sentinel. The townspeople had gathered outside, their eyes wide with fear, their murmurs filling the air. Something terrible was about to unfold, and Poirot was determined to be the one to stop it. But as he approached the church, a sense of dread washed over him. It felt too easy. The killer was playing him, luring him into a trap. Poirot reached the church door and paused. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant chime of the clock, marking the final seconds. Poirot stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. The air was heavy with tension. He knew the killer was somewhere inside, watching him, waiting for the moment when he would make his move. But where? As he ascended the staircase toward the bell tower, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. The faintest rustling sound reached his ear, something moving in the shadows. Poirot's hand instinctively went to his pocket, grasping for his revolver. But before he could react, a voice, cold and distant, spoke from behind him. "You should have stayed out of it, Poirot. Now, you are too late." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot spun around, his heart racing. But there was no one there, only the darkness closing in. A single chilling thought gripped him. Was the killer already gone? Had he fallen into the trap he'd been so carefully set up for? The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, and as Poirot turned back toward the stairs, he heard a single, final echo, a bell tolling from above. The last letter had been delivered, and Poirot was running out of time. The emotional climax, the trap closes. The room was suffocating in its silence, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Poirot stood at the center of the dimly lit church, the weight of his every decision pressing down on him like an unbearable force. His eyes flickered around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that would betray the killer's position. But the silence remained unbroken, save for the faint, distant chime of the church bell, its toll marking time that seemed to stand still. Poirot's mind was sharp, clearer than ever, but his heart was heavy. The stakes had never been so high. He had solved countless cases before, but this one was different. The murders, the twisted game with the alphabet, it all led to this moment. The killer was in the room, and yet, somehow, he still couldn't see them. He stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the cold stone floor. "I know you are here," he called out, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority. "I know you've been watching me, studying me, trying to predict my every move. But you've underestimated one thing: the human mind is more unpredictable than you can ever fathom." For a brief moment, there was no answer, only the unsettling hum of tension building in the air. Then, a shadow shifted in the corner of the room. Poirot's eyes snapped to it, but it was gone before he could pinpoint it. "I've been inside your head," Poirot continued, his voice low but steady. "I understand the dark places you've been, the need for revenge, the obsession with control. But it's not too late for you to end this. I know what drives you." A sharp laugh broke the silence, echoing through the church. It was cold, devoid of warmth, and it sent a shiver down Poirot's spine. From the shadows, a figure emerged, their face obscured by a dark hood. The killer had been waiting for Poirot to come to them. "Do you, Poirot?" The voice was muffled, but the bitterness in it was unmistakable. "Do you really understand? You think you know everything about me, about my past. You know nothing." The figure stepped forward, the hood falling away, and Poirot's heart skipped a beat. Samar, the town's historian, the very man who had been by his side through most of the investigation. The one person Poirot had trusted. Samar's face was contorted with rage. But there was something else, something deeper. A vulnerability that Poirot had not seen before, a raw pain that seemed to seep through his cold exterior. "It's always been you, Poirot, hasn't it?" Samar spat, his hands trembling as they clenched into fists. "You always thought you could solve it all, but you've never understood the burden of history, of what was done to me, to my family. They took everything from me, everything." Poirot's gaze softened as he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Samar, you are not a murderer. This obsession, this vengeance will only consume you. The pain you feel, the loss, I understand it. But killing, it will never bring them back. It will never heal you." Samar's eyes darkened, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts. "You think I don't know that. You think I don't know the cost. But I had to make them pay. The town, the people who destroyed everything I loved, they will never forget what I've done, and neither will you." Poirot's mind raced as he processed the unfolding truth. Samar's motives weren't just about the murders, they were about reclaiming something lost, something buried in the town's past. The killings were part of a twisted ritual, an attempt to erase the ghosts of history, to rewrite a narrative that had tormented him for years. And now, Poirot stood in the way of that vision. "Samar," Poirot said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency, "you are not alone in your suffering. But you cannot erase the past by making others suffer. You must stop this, or it will destroy you." For a moment, there was silence. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of their words, the truth hanging between them like an unspoken promise. But then, with a sudden, violent motion, Samar lunged forward, his hands grasping for the weapon hidden beneath his coat. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged as he snarled, "You think you can stop me now? It's too late, Poirot. The last letter has already been delivered." Poirot reacted in an instant, his trained mind and steady hand guiding him through the danger. He sidestepped just in time, feeling the sharp edge of the knife pass mere inches from his skin. With swift precision, Poirot grabbed Samar's wrist, twisting it until the weapon fell from his grasp, clattering to the floor with a deafening noise. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the heavy breathing of the two men. Poirot's chest rose and fell with the effort, his eyes locked on Samar's, filled with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "You were never going to win, Samar." Twist ending. The shadows unveil. The air inside the dimly lit study was thick with the stench of tension, every corner heavy with the secrets it held. Poirot, his mind buzzing with the fragments of clues that had come together in a maddening mosaic, stood frozen, staring at the door. The voice that had taunted him through the investigation now echoed in his mind, the cryptic words replaying like a haunting refrain. The final piece is yet to fall into place. His pulse quickened as he pieced it together. The missing puzzle, the key to everything, was hidden in plain sight, and the last letter, now the final victim, would complete the twisted game. But as Poirot stepped forward, ready to confront the murderer, his instincts screamed at him to stop. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. His thoughts raced. Who could it be? Everyone had been accounted for, and yet someone had been working from the shadows, pulling the strings, manipulating them all. And then, in the stillness, it came. The sudden creak of a chair, the unmistakable sound of someone rising from the corner of the room where they'd remained unnoticed. Poirot spun, his hand instinctively reaching for the hidden revolver tucked inside his coat, but before he could make a move, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was Lisa Asher. His breath caught in his throat. Lisa, the grieving daughter. The woman who had seemed so innocent, so fragile. She had been at the heart of it all, connected to the first victim, Alice. She had seemed lost, caught up in the chaos of the murders. But now, as the truth hit Poirot like a thunderclap, he realized that Lisa had been playing him from the very beginning. "I suppose you are surprised, Monsieur Poirot," Lisa said, her voice eerily calm, void of the despair he had once seen in her eyes. "You must be, after all this time, after everything you've uncovered." Poirot's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The woman who had appeared so devastated, so overwhelmed by the deaths of those around her, was now standing before him, cold, calculating, and unrecognizable. You were the one," Poirot whispered, his voice barely audible, but full of disbelief. "But why? Why all of this?" Lisa's lips curled into a smile, that was as chilling as it was cold. "You are not the only one who can solve puzzles, Monsieur Poirot. It's quite simple, really. Revenge. A long, long time coming." Poirot's eyes widened in realization. Revenge. But for what? For whom? She stepped closer, the shadows seeming to embrace her as she moved, a ghost in the room. "You see, Poirot, this was never about the town's forgotten history or the alphabet murders. It was always about my mother. She was the one who suffered. She was the one betrayed by those you trust. Your precious dark secrets, your criminals, they were nothing compared to the real crime." Poirot's chest tightened, his mind struggling to catch up. He had expected many things, but this, the woman he had thought was a victim, a tragic figure, this was something he could never have foreseen. You are her daughter," Poirot stammered. The implications hit him like a punch to the gut. The town's history, the betrayal, the dark secrets, everything connected back to a scandal that Poirot had never fully understood. And now, standing before him was the woman who had been betrayed, and whose mother had been a victim of a crime long buried. Lisa's gaze hardened. "Yes, I am her daughter. But you don't know the whole story, Poirot. My mother, was the one who paid for the sins of others. She was abandoned, her reputation destroyed, and her name erased from history. The people who did this, they thought they could forget. They thought they could get away with it. But I've made sure that everyone remembers. Everyone." Poirot's stomach churned. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the weight of the truth was crushing. All these murders, the letters, the carefully orchestrated killings, they were never about the town or its dark history. It was always about Lisa's mother, her shame, her betrayal. And the deaths. They were Lisa's revenge, one murder for each letter of the alphabet, each victim representing someone who had played a part in her mother's downfall. "You've killed them all," Poirot said, the horror of it sinking in. "You've killed them for her, for your mother." Lisa nodded slowly, her eyes dark with the unspoken pain of a lifetime. "And now, you are the last. You've gotten too close to the truth. But don't worry, Monsieur Poirot. I am not going to kill you." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. His mind scrambled to comprehend her words. Was she playing him? Was this another game? But then, with a cruel smile, Lisa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the final letter, the last piece of the puzzle. "The game is almost over, Poirot," Lisa said softly, holding the letter out to him. "But you should know something. This is the letter you'll—" The climax, the final showdown. The rain lashed against the windows of the crumbling church, its ancient walls holding the weight of forgotten secrets. The scent of mildew and dust filled the air, mingling with the raw tension that hung like a thick fog. Poirot stood at the altar, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the room. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet seemed to echo in the silence, a foreboding reminder of the final confrontation that was about to unfold. Across from him, Lisa Asher stood, her face pale but resolute, a cold smirk playing on her lips. The manipulator, the puppeteer, the one who had been weaving a web of death for months. She had been playing a deadly game with Poirot's hand. Now the game was coming to its tragic conclusion. "You've played your part well, Monsieur Poirot," Lisa's voice echoed softly, the mockery clear in her words. "But now the game is finished." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his hands clasped behind his back. He was calm, as always, but something in his gaze betrayed the weight of the final moments. "You have been careful, Miss Asher, but even the cleverest of plans can fall apart." Lisa's lips trembled for the briefest moment, a flicker of vulnerability passing through her eyes before the mask returned. She moved toward the old rotting pews, her fingers brushing against the worn wood, as if seeking some comfort in the past. Her gaze never left Poirot. "I did what I had to do," she murmured, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't understand, Poirot. It was never about revenge. Not really. It was about control. Control over the ones who wronged my mother. Control over my own fate. They thought they could bury her, erase her from history. But I would make sure everyone knew her name, everyone paid the price for what they did." Poirot's brow furrowed as he stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Control, you say, but at what cost? You have become the thing you despised, a murderer, a killer." Lisa's eyes darkened, her composure finally shattered, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands gripping her hair in frustration. "I never wanted this, Poirot. I never wanted to kill. But they made me. They pushed me until there was nothing left. And now they'll never forget." Poirot stood silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. But in his mind, the pieces were falling into place. Control, revenge. A long, slow burn of grief and rage that had led to this moment. This wasn't just a spree of killings, it was the final act of someone who had been broken long ago. He stepped closer, his voice soft now, almost sympathetic. "But what you don't see, Miss Asher, is that you were never in control. You have been a pawn in someone else's game all along." Lisa's head jerked up, her wide eyes searching his face for an explanation. "A pawn? What are you talking about?" Poirot's lips curled into a slight frown, his gaze sharp as ever. "You were led down this path, just as they wanted. Your mother's betrayal, it was only the beginning. You were manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to push your buttons." Before Lisa could respond, Poirot reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a final letter, a letter that had been hidden, tucked away for far too long. He held it up for her to see, and her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked onto the familiar initials printed in bold ink. L.A. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the letter, but Poirot pulled it back just out of her grasp. "You see, Miss Asher, this is not the end. The game isn't over. Here is more to this mystery than just you and your mother's vengeance." Lisa's face drained of color. She staggered back as if the weight of the revelation had physically struck her. What is this? What are you talking about? Poirot held her gaze, his eyes piercing and calculating. The initials in the letter, they belong to someone who has been orchestrating everything from the shadows, someone who knew exactly what you would do, who pushed you to become their instrument of chaos. Lisa's face twisted with confusion and fear. No, I didn't. But Poirot was already moving. His eyes never left her, and with a final heartbreaking sigh, he spoke. You were never the mastermind, Miss Asher. You were simply part of a much larger, much darker plan. Someone else has been pulling the strings. Someone who will stop at nothing to see their game completed. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder as if approaching from somewhere deep in the darkness. Poirot tensed, his mind racing. The game was not over. The killer was merely a piece in a larger puzzle, and now the truth was about to be revealed. Final twist. The truth is unveiled. As Poirot turned to face the doorway, a shadow stepped into the light, a tall figure, face obscured by a hood, the air thick with the promise of something far worse than what had already transpired. The room seemed to close in around him, and for the first time in the entire investigation, Poirot felt the grip of uncertainty. The figure spoke in a cold, emotionless tone. Poirot, you've come so close, but not close enough. Poirot froze, his heart pounding. His mind raced, and for the first time he was unsure of his next move. The figure stepped forward, the weight of their presence suffocating, and as the hooded figure pulled back their cloak, Poirot's worst fear came true. The murderer had always been a part of the plan. The killer was only a puppet, a pawn, the true mastermind, someone Poirot had never even considered. And just like that, Poirot understood. The game had never been about Lisa, her mother, or even the alphabet murders. It was always about something far more twisted, far more dangerous. The final letter, the one he'd found, was the clue, the final step toward unlocking a chain of events that would change everything. The shadows had been watching, and now the game would end only when the mastermind said it would. Resolution. The endless game. As the hooded figure stepped into the light, Poirot's mind raced, but he knew that this case, this complex, mind-bending web of deception, was far from over. In that moment, he realized that the thin line between sanity and madness had been crossed long ago, and no one, least of all Poirot himself, would ever truly know who was in control. The final puzzle had yet to be solved, and as the figure in the shadows whispered the next clue, Poirot was left standing, caught in the tangled web of mystery. But the truth, the true truth, was still to be revealed. Who do you think is the mastermind behind the ABC murders? Which part of the story shocked you the most? What if the death of a matriarch wasn't an accident, but a carefully planned murder? Open with Emily's scream on the stormy night, with dramatic lightning flashing over Styles Manor. The storm raged outside, its howling winds rattling the windows of Styles Manor, a grand estate that stood like a dark sentinel against the blackened sky. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, too quiet. The family had all gone to bed, or so it seemed. But in the dead of night, a scream shattered the silence, cutting through the storm's fury like a knife. In the silence of the storm, the manor's echo was broken by a scream, the scream of a family shattered by betrayal. The voice was a woman's, high-pitched, filled with terror. It echoed through the vast halls, drawing the sleepy servants and family members into the foyer. In a matter of moments, the manorance, filled with the warm comfort of wealth and luxury, was turned upside down, a house frozen in panic. Emily, the wealthy and revered matriarch, lay motionless in her grand bedroom. Her once pristine face was now pale, her eyes wide open in a stare of horror, as if caught in the final moments of a nightmare. The scent of death lingered in the air, as pungent as the storm outside, and in her hand, clutched tightly as though it were a lifeline, was an old, faded photograph. A photograph that held a secret no one had ever known. The family gathered, faces pale, and filled with confusion and fear, as the realization hit them like a cold wave. Emily had been poisoned. The very air seemed to freeze, suspicions crawling beneath the surface of polite conversation. Was it an accident, or was this calculated, a dark act of betrayal? Alfred, Emily's young husband, appeared disoriented, his eyes darting nervously from one family member to another. His alibi was vague, but his distress seemed genuine, perhaps too genuine. John and Mary Cavendish, Emily's grown children, stood in the doorway, their faces masks of shock, yet something in their eyes seemed off, a bit too calm, a bit too rehearsed. And then there was Cynthia, a mysterious woman with an unsettling presence, who had only recently begun spending time at the manor. Her eyes flickered nervously as she glanced at the others, her lips pursed tight. Why was she here? What had she seen? But it was Evelyn Howard, Emily's personal companion, who seemed to take the loss hardest. She clung to Emily's lifeless body with an intensity that felt far too intimate, her grief bordering on desperation. Her closeness to Alfred raised suspicions. Was there more to their relationship than just a professional bond? Detective Ian Mallock stood at the threshold, his presence commanding attention. A sharp, intelligent man, he wasn't part of the family, an outsider, which, in this case, was a blessing. He studied the scene, noting every detail, every facial expression, every shift in the room's atmosphere. He knew this wasn't a simple case of poisoning. There was something more, something deeper, and he would need to uncover it before the manor's legacy and its family came crashing down. But there was something else, something Ian couldn't yet put his finger on. The photograph in Emily's hand wasn't just a keepsake, it was a message. And it would lead him down a path full of secrets, lies, and deadly intentions. The storm outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside Styles Manor. As the clock ticked away, one question lingered in the air like a suffocating fog. Who killed Emily in Oglethorpe, and why? And just as the family began to murmur, trying to make sense of the horror unfolding before them, Ian's eyes flicked to the window. In the distance, a shadow moved, a figure, barely visible against the storm. Was it a trick of the mind, or was someone watching the manor from afar? The storm had just begun. The investigation begins, the web of secrets. The chill of the storm seemed to seep into the very bones of Styles Manor, leaving a tension in the air that felt as heavy as the rain battering against the windows. In the midst of this suffocating atmosphere, Detective Ian Mallock arrived, his sharp eyes cutting through the chaos like a blade. Tall and composed, he wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough to quiet the room, as the family members, already shaken by the murder, turned their eyes toward him, trying to read the expression on his face. Ian was no stranger to death, nor to the layers of deception that often clouded a murder investigation. He had solved many cases, each more complex than the last. But something about this house, with its dark corners and uneasy secrets, felt different. And as he stepped into the grand foyer, he realized the truth. The murder of Emily Inglethorpe was not the act of a random killer, but rather the work of someone who knew her intimately. Someone who had been hiding their true motives beneath a veil of politeness. The family members were gathered in tense silence, eyes darting nervously between each other. Ian could feel the palpable fear, but he also sensed something far darker: guilt. Each of them seemed to carry a burden, and their strained expressions betrayed the weight of secrets they were desperately trying to conceal. His first observation was that Emily's death was not a simple act of violence. There was method to it, an almost calculated precision. It wasn't just poison. It was poison carefully chosen, mixed in a way that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. But who would want Emily dead, and why? His gaze shifted to Alfred, the young husband, who stood near the fireplace, his eyes filled with the kind of grief that felt almost rehearsed. Ian noticed how Alfred clutched his coat tighter, his hands trembling just slightly, a nervous tic, or a sign of something more. The man had a lot to gain from Emily's death, and Ian's mind began to race with the possibilities. Then there was John Cavendish, the stepson, standing stiffly by the window, staring out into the storm as if he could will the answers to come to him. He had been at odds with Emily for years. Anne could sense the unresolved tension that lingered in the air whenever John was near her. But could he have killed her? The thought seemed plausible, but Anne wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Not yet. Mary Cavendish, his wife, stood next to him, her face pale, her lips trembling slightly. Was it grief or fear? She avoided eye contact with Anne, glancing nervously at Alfred, and then at the floor. The more Anne watched her, the more he felt an undercurrent of something off, something not quite right. And then there was Cynthia, the mysterious woman whose arrival at the manor had been recent, and whose presence in the aftermath of Emily's death was almost too convenient. Anne had yet to understand her place in this web of secrets, but something about her didn't sit well. She seemed too eager to please, too quick to offer sympathy. A woman who was hiding something of that, Anne was certain. Finally, there was Evelyn Howard, Emily's personal companion, who had been with her for years. Evelyn's grief seemed genuine, but there was something in the way her eyes flickered when Anne spoke, something in the way her hands clasped together tightly in front of her that felt off. Her attachment to Alfred was undeniable, and Anne couldn't ignore the possibility that she had more than a professional interest in her employer's young husband. As he began his investigation, Anne's mind raced through the facts. Emily had recently changed her will, leaving the majority of her fortune to Alfred. The timing couldn't have been more suspicious. He'd seen enough to know that greed was often the driving force behind murder, and Emily's will had given Alfred everything except for one thing: her daughter's share of the estate, which had been left out entirely. Was it possible that someone was trying to cover up more than just a murder? Anne's instincts told him this wasn't just about money, it was about something deeper, something tied to the very foundation of Styles Manor. As he examined the room, Anne's eyes briefly caught the glint of something metallic on the floor. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against a small object half hidden beneath the carpet. It was a key, no ordinary key, but one that seemed to belong to something locked away, out of sight. Anne's mind clicked into place. Was there a hidden room in the manor? And if so, what was inside it? The family was watching him, their faces a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. They had no idea what Anne had already uncovered, or how close they were to exposing the truth. But one thing was certain: he was getting closer. The web of secrets was tightening, and no one in this house was innocent. Anne rose slowly, his gaze sweeping over the room. He could feel the walls closing in, the tension thick in the air. He was just about to speak when the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the manor into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was the storm outside and the rapid breathing of the family. Then, just as suddenly, a sharp scream echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Someone had found something. But who? And what had they discovered? The investigation had only just begun. Cliffhanger ending. Anne's hand instinctively reached for his flashlight, his mind racing with the possibilities. But just as he turned, a loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by a deep, guttural voice. "You are getting too close, detective." The chase for the truth was about to become far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The suspects, layers of deception. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of Styles Manor, but inside, a quieter, more ominous storm was brewing. Ian Malik stood in the center of the grand drawing room, his gaze flicking over each person as they shuffled uncomfortably in their seats. The truth was buried deep beneath layers of deception, and Ian was determined to peel back each layer no matter how painful it might be. Alfred, the young newlywed husband, was the first to catch Ian's attention. Standing by the fireplace, his face a mask of grief, Alfred seemed to be the very picture of a man undone by the death of his beloved wife. But Ian wasn't fooled by his appearance. The nervous way Alfred kept adjusting his collar, the way his eyes darted away every time they met Anne's, there was something off about him. His alibi was vague, claiming he had been in the study, going over some papers. Yet, there was no one to corroborate his story, and Ion couldn't shake the suspicion that Alfred was hiding something more than just grief. The fact that he would inherit Emily's fortune, and the manor didn't help matters. Was this murder the work of a man whose fortune suddenly appeared within his grasp? Ion turned his attention to John Cavendish, Emily's estranged stepson. The man stood rigidly, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He had always been at odds with Emily. Everyone knew that, but did it go deeper than mere disagreement? John's history of conflict with her, the bitterness, the long-standing grudges, made him an obvious suspect. He had everything to gain from her death, and Ion noted the tightness in his jaw whenever Alfred's name was mentioned. But there was something else. John's wife, Mary. She stood beside him, her posture stiff, her hands clasped tightly together, as though she were trying to hold herself together in a place where everything was falling apart. Did she know more than she let on? The tension between the Cavendishes was palpable. Ion could see it in the way they avoided each other's gaze, the way their words seemed to hang in the air like unresolved arguments. Mary's face was pale, and her trembling hands suggested fear of something more than just her stepmother's death. Was it guilt? Or was there a deeper secret between them all that no one was willing to acknowledge? Had their ambition for the manor's inheritance driven them to violence? Then there was Cynthia, the mysterious woman who had arrived in the wake of Emily's death. Her presence seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. She wasn't family, but she acted as though she had every right to be there, as if the manor was just as much hers as it was the Cavendishes'. Ion's instinct told him there was more to her than met the eye. She had been particularly interested in the details of Emily's will, asking far too many questions for someone who wasn't directly involved in the family. Was she an opportunist, looking to exploit Emily's death for her own gain? Or did she have another, more personal connection to the deceased? What was her true motive? Evelyn Howard, Emily's personal companion, was the final piece of the puzzle. Her grief appeared sincere, but Ion knew all too well that sorrow could be a powerful mask. The way Evelyn's eyes lingered on Alfred whenever he spoke, the way her voice quivered when she mentioned his name there, was more to their relationship than a mere employer and employee dynamic. Could Evelyn's attachment to Alfred have led her to act out of passion or jealousy? Ion couldn't ignore the possibility that her affection for him was not as innocent as it seemed. But was she involved in the murder, or was she simply a pawn in a game played by others? As Ion took in the group, he quickly realized that the stories they told didn't match up. There were too many contradictions, too many inconsistencies. Alfred's alibi didn't hold water. John and Mary's emotions were strangely muted. Cynthia's curiosity about the will was more than suspicious, and Evelyn's attachment to Alfred only deepened the web of confusion. Each person was hiding something, whether it was an affair, a grudge, or a long-held secret. But what stood out to Ion above all was the way each suspect's story seemed to crisscross, each one intersecting with another's in ways that made no sense at first glance. The question wasn't who had a motive, it was who had the opportunity to strike in the most hidden, unexpected way. Ion's sharp mind worked quickly, connecting dots no one else saw, but he needed more. He needed to understand the connections between these people, and more importantly, what they were all hiding from him. As he stood there, analyzing their faces, he realized that this wasn't just about greed, it was about something far more complicated, something buried beneath the surface. Suddenly, the sharp, sudden sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the house, causing everyone to jump. Ion's eyes flicked toward the direction of the noise, Alfred's study, where the will was kept. He hadn't noticed it before, but now the sudden realization hit him. The study. That's where the answers were. Before Ion could make a move, he heard footsteps. Someone was rushing toward the study. But who? Was it Alfred? Or was someone else trying to get to the will before he could? The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone seemed to be on edge, and Ion knew that the clock was ticking. Someone was trying to cover their tracks, and he was getting closer to the truth. But who would make the first move, and would it be too late for Ian to stop them? Cliffhanger ending. Ian moved swiftly toward the study, but just as his hand reached for the door, a sharp voice echoed from behind him. "You'll never get the truth if you don't know where to look." Ian froze, his pulse quickening. He turned slowly to find Cynthia standing in the doorway, a knowing smile on her lips, her eyes glinting with something far too dangerous to be a coincidence. The game had changed, and Ian was no longer the only one playing it. The first twist, midpoint, the hidden will. The manor was unnervingly quiet as Ian paced through its grand halls, his footsteps echoing off the cold stone floors. He couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing, a piece of the puzzle that everyone had overlooked. Every suspect had a motive, every story seemed warped in some way, but one thing gnawed at him: the will. The moment Ian had set foot in Styles Manor, he had been told about Emily Inglethorpe's recent change of will. Everyone had pointed to Alfred, the young husband, as the prime beneficiary. But when Ian had scoured the study, searching through piles of papers, what he found didn't add up. The will that was meant to settle the family's future was nowhere to be found. Ian's heart rate picked up. The document that could give him the answers had vanished. Had it been taken, or had it never been there to begin with? Frustration built up within him. Someone was playing a very dangerous game, and it seemed like they were always one step ahead. But Ian was no fool. There was a missing link, a thread he could pull, and he had to find it before someone else did. He turned his attention back to Emily's body, and a sudden thought struck him. Had she left a clue behind? Ian walked back to the room where Emily's lifeless form had been found. He approached her desk, meticulously combing through the papers she had kept close. Then his gaze landed on something unexpected: a letter. It wasn't just any letter. This was the one Emily had been clutching in her hand when she died, the one that had fallen from her grasp as her life slipped away. Ian reached for it carefully, as though touching it might trigger something. The envelope was old, its edges frayed, the ink slightly faded, but the words on the front sent a chill down his spine. "To my beloved Alfred," it read. The irony of it struck Ian instantly. The very man who stood to inherit everything from her was also the one she had seemingly written to just before her death. Was it a confession, or a last plea for help? With trembling hands, Ian opened the letter and began to read. "Alfred, my love, by the time you read this, it may already be too late. I know you've been hiding something from me, and I can no longer turn a blind eye. The truth will come out, whether you wish it or not. I know what you've done, and I know what you plan to do. You may think I am in the dark, but I've seen enough to understand. You cannot hide from me anymore. The will I've written is not what you believe it to be. You've been deceived, just as I have." The letter trailed off abruptly, as if Emily had been interrupted in the middle of writing, or perhaps had been cut off by something else. The words left a lingering sense of unease. Alfred, the charming young man, was hiding something, the secret so deep that Emily had felt the need to write about it before her untimely death. But as Ian processed the message, another thought occurred to him. The will wasn't the only thing missing. If Emily had been writing this letter to Alfred, why was it hidden away in her desk, and why had she not revealed it to anyone before? As Ian's mind raced, the door to the study creaked open. He turned sharply, but it was only Evelyn, Emily's personal companion, standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, as if she had seen something she shouldn't have. She stepped forward hesitantly, glancing at the letter in Ian's hands. I didn't mean to intrude," Evelyn stammered, her voice shaking. "But she faltered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know what it says. I know what Emily knew. But it's not just Alfred you should be worried about. Everyone here, we've all been hiding something." Ian's pulse quickened. What was she implying? Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes darting nervously between Ian and the letter. "You think this is about the inheritance, don't you? You think Alfred was the only one who stood to gain. But Emily, she was a smart woman. She knew what they were all capable of. She wasn't the fool you think she was." Ian's mind raced. Was Evelyn trying to throw him off the scent? Or was she giving him a critical clue? But just as Ion opened his mouth to ask her what she meant, the sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation. A sharp voice called out from behind them. "What are you doing with Emily's things?" It was Alfred. His face was flushed, his eyes wide, as though he had just walked in on something he wasn't meant to see. Ion turned slowly, his gaze never leaving Alfred. The tension in the room thickened, suffocating in its intensity. Alfred's lips twitched nervously, his hand clenching at his side, the very picture of a man caught in a lie. "I was simply looking for something," Ion said coolly, his eyes locked on Alfred's. "The truth, it seems, is well hidden here." Alfred's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering between Ion and Evelyn. But before he could respond, a loud crack echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to freeze time. It was the unmistakable sound of a door opening, and a figure appeared in the hallway. It was Cynthia, her face expressionless, her eyes gleaming with a coldness that sent a chill down Ion's spine. "Seems like we're all digging for the truth, Detective," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "But I wonder, are we digging for the same thing?" The walls of the manor seemed to close in on Ion as he stood there, surrounded by enemies who each held a piece of the puzzle and each seemed more than willing to keep their secrets hidden. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Ion prepared to confront them, a sudden, sharp sound erupted from the hallway, a muffled scream followed by a violent crash. Without thinking, Ion bolted from the room, his heart racing. What was happening now? Who had screamed, and what had they found? But as he reached the hallway, he stopped in his tracks. There, in front of him, lay a figure crumpled on the ground, motionless. It was Evelyn. And in her hand, a piece of paper torn and crumpled held the final key to unlocking Emily's last secret. Meanwhile, a strange clue surfaces: a bottle of medicine with traces of strychnine. The manor had descended into a state of uneasy quiet as Ion lingered in the darkened hallway, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of secrets, lies, and accusations. Each step forward seemed like a step deeper into a labyrinth of deception, and yet, one thing remained tantalizingly out of his reach: the key to understanding who had murdered Emily Inglethorpe and why. But it wasn't until a sharp knock at the study door that Ion's focus shifted. It was Dr. Langdon, the family's trusted physician. His face was pale, his brow furrowed with concern, as though he had stumbled upon something that could shatter the fragile illusion of order that had settled over the house since Emily's death. "Detective, Doctor." Langdon's voice cracked slightly, his eyes darting to the floor as though he feared the answer to his next words. "I've found something that doesn't sit right." Ion's pulse quickened. He gestured for Dr. Langdon to continue, though a knot was already beginning to tighten in his stomach. "What is it?" Dr. Langdon held out a small vial, the glass bottle shimmering faintly under the dim lights. It was unmarked, the label faded and worn, but one thing was unmistakable: the dark brown liquid that still clung to the sides of the bottle. Ion's eyes narrowed. "This," Dr. Langdon said, his voice low, almost reverent. "This was found in the old cupboard in the drawing room, tucked away behind some books. It's a medicinal tonic, but it's not just that. It's tainted. The liquid inside it's laced with strychnine." Ion's gaze locked onto the bottle, the sinister truth settling over him like a cold fog. Strychnine. The poison known for its brutal, agonizing effects, one that could cause convulsions and paralysis within minutes of ingestion. It was a poison of choice for someone who wanted to watch their victim suffer, to take pleasure in the slow unraveling of life. But how? How had this deadly substance entered Emily's system without anyone noticing? Ion's mind raced. He could already picture it: Emily, the matriarch, sitting in her grand chair by the fire, sipping her drink, perhaps believing it was just another of her nightly remedies. Perhaps she had trusted the medicine, its harmless appearance deceiving her. its contents sealed in an unassuming bottle that had been placed into her hands by someone she never thought twice about. The question lingered like smoke in the air. Who had slipped the poison into her daily routine? And more importantly, why had it been so carefully hidden? He turned the bottle in his hand, examining it closely. There was no obvious sign of tampering, no marks on the cork or seal that suggested someone had altered it. This wasn't a hasty, sloppy attempt to kill. It was calculated, precise. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. Ayan's eyes flashed to Dr. Langdon. "How did you find this?" "I didn't," Langdon replied, his voice thick with confusion. It wasn't in her regular medical cabinet, detective. This bottle was hidden in a small compartment behind a stack of books. I didn't even know it was there until I stumbled upon it by accident." Ayan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Someone had been careful, deliberate. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was premeditated. Whoever had wanted Emily dead had known exactly how to execute it, and they had been meticulous enough to ensure no one would discover the true cause of her death until it was too late. But there was still one glaring question. How had the strychnine been introduced into Emily's system without raising suspicion? Ayan's mind began to flicker through the timeline of Emily's final days. She had been ill, yes, but no one had suspected anything sinister. The family had all assumed it was just the usual ailments of someone her age. Was that part of the plan? To mask the poisoning with the guise of old age and poor health? He looked back at Dr. Langdon, who stood nervously in the doorway, his hands wringing at his sides. "You didn't see anything unusual with the medicine she was taking?" Dr. Langdon hesitated, his eyes flitting to the ground. Nothing. But I've been reviewing her medical history, and now I wonder if I missed something. There's been no record of strychnine in her prescriptions or treatments. It shouldn't have been there at all. Ayan's heart raced as the pieces began to click into place. Emily's death was no accident. It was the result of someone who knew her routines, someone who had access to her medicines, someone who could easily slip the poison into her daily regimen without a second glance. And then it hit him, a realization that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The letter. Emily's letter to Alfred. She had written about a betrayal. Ayan now understood that it wasn't just about greed. It was about control, manipulation, and the slow destruction of trust. But there was more. The medicine, the bottle of strychnine. If the bottle had been hidden, who else knew about it? Someone in the house must have known of its existence, and someone must have known how to use it to murder Emily without arousing suspicion. Ayan turned the bottle in his hand once more, staring at the dark liquid inside. It was a calculated risk, a deadly one. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. A figure stepped out from behind the doorframe. Alfred. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was a flicker of fear in his expression that betrayed him. "I told you it wasn't me," Alfred said, his voice sharp with defensiveness. "I had nothing to do with it. The will's already mine, don't you get it? Why would I need to kill her?" But Ayan's eyes remained fixed on him, cold and unyielding. "You don't need to kill her, Alfred," he said slowly. "You just need to make sure no one else gets in your way." As the tension thickened, a loud crash rang through the hall, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps. Ayan spun around just in time to see Cynthia stumbling backward, her face drained of color. She was holding something in her hand, another letter, this one torn and stained, as though it had been hastily hidden. "Detective," Cynthia gasped, her voice shaking. "Didn't mean to, but you need to see this. It's the truth." Emily knew. She knew everything. But before she could explain, a muffled sound echoed from the far end of the corridor, a door creaking open. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by the darkness. It was Evelyn, but she wasn't alone, and the look on her face was enough to send a wave of dread through Ayan's entire body. Cliffhanger ending. In her hand, Evelyn held something unmistakable, a second vial of poison. The pieces were falling into place, but Ayan still had no idea who was behind it all. Who do you think is the prime suspect? The deeper investigation, danger looms. Ian sat in his study, the weight of the case pressing down on him like an unrelenting storm. The walls of Styles Manor, once a place of grandeur and comfort, now felt suffocating, as if they too were hiding dark secrets. The deeper Ian delved into Emily Inglethorpe's life, the more sinister the picture became. He had uncovered fragments of motives, greed, betrayal, jealousy, but something felt incomplete. His thoughts were interrupted when he stumbled upon a shocking revelation. Emily had been arguing with someone the night she died. The argument was brief but intense, and the sound of it had been overheard by several members of the household. Ian had already interviewed everyone, but no one could provide any details about the source of the heated dispute. Whispers about it danced around the manor, yet no one dared speak the truth. The mystery gnawed at him, filling him with unease. Who could Emily have been fighting with, and why? Ian's instincts told him that the answer was closer than he thought, that the killer was someone who knew Emily well, someone she trusted. He was determined to find out who had been involved in that argument and what it had been about. Was it related to her will, or was there a darker, more personal issue at play? He had one lead left, a hidden letter Emily had been writing just days before her death, an angry, desperate scrawl about something she had discovered. She had written it in a hurry, almost as though she feared someone might find it before she had a chance to act on it. But where was it? What had she known? Ian continued his search in the quiet hours of the evening, sifting through Emily's personal belongings. As he rifled through the drawers of her desk, a creaking noise made him freeze. A faint shiver of dread skittered down his spine. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound, the door. It was ajar, too slightly. Ian's fingers brushed against the concealed edge of an envelope, tucked under a pile of papers. His heart skipped. Was this it? Before he could reach for it, the door burst open with a force that startled him. He barely had time to react when a shadow lunged toward him, a figure, masked, with gloved hands that shoved him back into the desk. Ian barely managed to roll out of the way, his heart racing in his chest as the chair crashed to the floor beside him. The figure moved quickly, too quickly, their intentions clear to silence him, to end his investigation before he could uncover the truth. Ian was already on the defensive, his mind working in overdrive as he tried to anticipate the attacker's next move. The figure lunged again, but Ian twisted, using his training to dodge the strike. With a swift motion, Ian knocked a nearby vase from the table, the porcelain shattering against the floor. In the chaos, the figure stumbled, and Ian took the opportunity to move. He ducked behind the desk, drawing in a sharp breath. He knew he was running out of time. The attacker came at him once more, but this time Ian was ready. He grabbed hold of the nearest item, a candlestick, and swung it with all his strength. The force of the blow knocked the figure back, sending them sprawling to the ground. But the struggle wasn't over. As the figure staggered to their feet, Ian could see a glimpse of their face, familiar, but just barely enough to place. Before he could act, the attacker was gone, disappearing into the shadows like a phantom. The silence that followed was deafening. Ian's pulse thundered in his ears as he fought to steady his breathing. His mind raced. This wasn't a random attack. Someone in the manor wanted him gone. And they weren't playing games. Despite the danger, Ian knew he had no choice but to press forward. Whoever had tried to kill him was desperate to hide something. He could almost feel the pressure building, and the trap was closing in around him. Someone in this house had orchestrated Emily's murder, and Ian was getting closer to the heart of it. Ian knew now that Emily had been far more aware of the danger around her than anyone realized. The argument, the letter, the deadly poison, it was all connected. But who had the most to gain from silencing her? His thoughts returned to the argument. It had been heated, yes, but who had she been arguing with? And more importantly, what had she uncovered? Ian's mind settled on one thing. Someone close to Emily was hiding a dangerous secret. In a fleeting moment he realized that the answers might not lie in the hidden letter, but in the people surrounding him. One of them had tried to kill him to keep the truth buried. The walls were closing in. Ian's danger was far from over. But in that fleeting moment of realization, another shiver crawled up his spine. Someone had been watching him from the shadows. He wasn't alone. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the room fell into darkness. Ian's heart skipped. He wasn't just being watched, he was being hunted. The question remained, who in this house would go to such lengths to protect their secret? Cliffhanger ending. As Ian reached for the door, the cold sensation of being followed crept into his skin, and in the darkness, he could hear a whisper, a soft, malicious murmur that sent a chill down his spine. "You are too close, detective. You've already made your last move." Just as the words echoed in his mind, a figure stepped forward into the darkness, blocking his escape. The final act, twists of fate. The tension in the air at Styles Manor was palpable as Detective Ian Malik paced the dimly lit study. He had pieced together the clues, connected the dots, but there was still something that gnawed at him, a deeper thread he hadn't fully unraveled. Now, after days of relentless investigation, the pieces were finally beginning to fall into place. Ian's eyes narrowed as he stared at Alfred across the room. The young, seemingly innocent husband of Emily Inglethorpe had been his prime suspect from the very beginning. Alfred had everything to gain from her death. But it wasn't until now, as Ian pieced together the fragmented bits of the puzzle, that the true nature of Alfred's intentions began to take shape. The once quiet, reserved man now seemed jittery, his gaze flickering around the room. He was beginning to crack under the pressure of the investigation. Alfred's alibi had always been weak, but now, Ian had uncovered something far more damning. Alfred had been having an affair with Evelyn Howard, Emily's personal companion. Ian could hardly believe it. Alfred, the devoted husband, had betrayed his wife in the most intimate way possible. But what made the situation more dangerous was that Alfred and Evelyn had been plotting to kill Emily for months. Their affair had spiraled into something darker, something fueled by ambition, greed, and desperation. Alfred had longed to be free of Emily's controlling influence, and Evelyn, too, had her own reasons for wanting to rid herself of the woman who had stood between her and a future with Alfred. The affair had started innocently enough, but as Ian dug deeper, he uncovered a sinister conspiracy to murder Emily, who had been suspicious of the growing relationship between Alfred and Evelyn. Emily had been no fool. She had known the whispers around her husband's infidelity and had started to put together the pieces of their betrayal. She had even started making plans to take action. Ian stood face to face with Alfred now, the final confrontation inevitable. He watched as the man shifted uncomfortably, guilt radiating from him in waves. It was clear that Alfred was beginning to realize just how close Ian had come to the truth. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Ian's voice was cold, steady. "You and Evelyn, you thought you could murder your way to freedom. But you didn't count on me, did you?" Alfred's face twisted with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You don't know what you are talking about," he spat, but Ian could see the cracks in his facade. The lie was wearing thin. Ian stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Alfred's face. "It wasn't just the affair that led to Emily's death, was it? You and Evelyn, you had a plan to ensure that Emily would be out of the picture for good. But what you didn't expect was Emily's foresight." The revelation seemed to hit Alfred like a ton of bricks. His face paled, and his hands trembled. The storm had been building for weeks, and now it was all crashing down on him. "She knew," Alfred whispered, his voice hoarse. "She knew we were planning to kill her." Ian's eyes sharpened. Yes, and she was smart enough to leave behind clues in her will. Clues about her suspicions of you and Evelyn. But there's more to the story, Alfred. Emily didn't just change her will, she hid something inside it, something that pointed directly to your betrayal. Alfred's expression flickered between fear and panic. Aeon pressed on. But the most brilliant part of her plan, Alfred, was the poison. Alfred's brow furrowed, confusion washing over him. What poison? She took the medicine every night. Aeon smiled coldly. Exactly. It wasn't the food, Alfred. Emily wasn't poisoned through her meals. It was the medicine she took every night, medicine that was supposed to ease her pain but instead became the instrument of her death. You and Evelyn had it all planned. The strychnine wasn't mixed into her food, it was hidden inside her nightly dose of medicine, and when she took it, she didn't even know what was happening. Slowly, surely, the poison did its work. Aeon watched as Alfred's face went from pale to a sickly shade of green. He had never seen someone look so defeated, so caught in the web they had so carefully spun. "But how could you be so sure, Detective?" Alfred croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Aeon leaned in closer, savoring the moment. Because Emily knew. She knew everything, and in her final moments, she left behind a clue that led me here. You didn't just murder her for her fortune. No, Alfred. This was about power. You wanted Emily out of the way so that you could take her place, but you didn't count on Emily having the last word. Alfred's lips quivered, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like an anchor. Aeon was certain no way had the answers. But just as the truth was about to come pouring out, a sudden realization hit him. The door slammed open behind them with a force that sent the room into chaos. Aeon whipped around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but the figure standing in the doorway froze him in his tracks. Standing there, cloaked in shadow, was Evelyn. Aeon's heart skipped a beat. The air in the room seemed to freeze as the two conspirators locked eyes. The twist was coming, and Aeon could feel it in his bones. The woman who had been Emily's confidant, her closest ally, had been the mastermind all along. Evelyn was no mere accomplice. She had orchestrated the entire murder, manipulating Alfred into doing her bidding. She was the true mastermind behind it all. And now, as Aeon faced her, he understood the full extent of the danger he was in. The room seemed to close in around him, and a cold chill ran down his spine. But Evelyn wasn't done. She stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You think you have all the answers, don't you, Detective?" Evelyn purred, her voice dripping with malice. "You are too late. The game's over." Aeon's pulse quickened. He had only one chance now to stop Evelyn before it was too late. But as she spoke, he realized something far more dangerous was unfolding. The secrets he had uncovered were far from over. Cliffhanger ending. Before Aeon could make his move, Evelyn raised her hand, and a sharp, metallic click echoed through the room. The trap had been set. In that split second, Aeon's mind raced. Was he about to be outwitted? Just as he took a step forward, the lights flickered and everything went black. The climax, the truth unveiled. The grand drawing room of Styles Manor was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the distant echoes of the storm outside. Aeon Malik stood at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. They were all here: Alfred, Evelyn, John and Mary Cavendish, Cynthia, and even the ever-so-stoic butler, Thomas. Each one of them had a part to play in this twisted drama, but only one was the true architect of the crime. Aeon's voice broke the stillness, smooth but carrying an edge. "I've pieced everything together," he said, his eyes sharp as daggers. "The lies, the deceit, the hidden motives. The time for secrets is over." He slowly began to walk around the room, his footsteps echoing in the hushed space, each word deliberate, each accusation a tightening noose. When Emily died, it wasn't just about money or love. It was about control, and it's time to uncover the truth. The room was tense, the faces of the suspects tight with apprehension. They could feel it, the endgame was near, and the weight of Aeon's words was suffocating. But no one spoke. No one dared to break the silence. Ion turned to face Alfred first. You were always the prime suspect, weren't you? The jealous husband, the one with the most to gain. But in the end, it wasn't just you. Alfred's face went pale. He was visibly shaking now, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His voice cracked when he spoke. What are you talking about, detective? Ion didn't respond. He moved on, his gaze turning toward John Cavendish. And you, John, the perfect scapegoat, you've been set up. Every clue, every piece of evidence was planted to point toward you, but you were innocent. Your handwriting was forged, the poison wasn't purchased by you, was Alfred who bought it, in secret, behind your back. John's eyes widened in disbelief. But how could that be? Ion's expression was cold, unyielding, because the real mastermind was standing right in front of me the entire time. His voice dropped to a whisper. It was Evelyn. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the room. Evelyn's face went ashen, her lips trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. But her eyes betrayed her. There was a flicker of panic, a glimmer of defeat. Evelyn, Ian continued, his voice steely, you orchestrated the entire plan. You used Alfred as your puppet, manipulating him, playing on his insecurities. And you framed John, knowing the evidence would lead straight to him. You planted the forged handwriting, the evidence of the poison being bought under his name. But the truth is, it was you. You and Alfred together. Ion's gaze shifted to Alfred, who was now visibly sweating, his face contorted with guilt. The affair, the betrayal. You two were in it together, weren't you? You killed Emily for the fortune, for the life you wanted to build together. But you didn't count on Emily's cleverness. She knew everything. Evelyn's lips parted, a cruel smile curling at the edges. You think you know it all, don't you, detective? She hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. You don't understand, do you? Emily was a fool. She never saw what was coming. She never knew the power we held, the power we would take. Ion didn't flinch. He was too close now to allow her to slip away. No, Evelyn, he said, his voice full of finality. It wasn't just about love or power. Emily had one last surprise for both of you. Evelyn froze, her smile faltering. What do you mean? Ian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled letter, Emily's final letter, the one she had written just before her death. He slowly unsealed it, holding it up for all to see. Emily left this letter behind. She knew she was walking into danger. She knew she wouldn't make it out alive. But there's one more thing she wanted to say, something you two missed. He unfolded the paper, his voice growing even more serious. In this letter, Emily reveals that her death might not have been an accident at all. She had her suspicions. She believed she was being poisoned over a longer period of time, and that the night she died, her medicine was the final dose. Everyone in the room was silent, their eyes wide with shock. Ian held the letter out, letting the words sink in. She suspected someone in her close circle, someone she trusted. And here is the twist. Evelyn, you were the one who had been carefully slipping the poison into her nightly dose, not just once, but over weeks. You made sure it would take its toll in the slowest, most insidious way. The room shifted. Tension crackled in the air, like an electric storm before the lightning strike. Evelyn's face contorted with fury, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. You can't do this, she spat, her voice rising in defiance. You don't know everything. You haven't uncovered the whole story. Ian stepped closer, his tone unwavering. No, Evelyn, the truth has already been revealed. You wanted Emily dead, and you got what you wanted. But now, your game is over. Just as Ian raised his hand to signal the arrest, a sudden movement froze him in place. It was Thomas, the butler, stepping forward with an expression of sheer horror on his face. Detective, there's one more thing you need to see. The room fell deathly silent as Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another letter. This one was different, more recent, and written in haste. Thomas handed it to Ian, who unfolded it carefully. His eyes scanned the words, his heart racing. To the one who will read this letter. If I am found dead, know this. My death was not a mere accident or a simple case of poisoning. It was orchestrated by someone in this house, someone very close to me. And if you believe you've uncovered the truth, you have not. I will leave you with one final clue. Look deeper. Look beyond the obvious. The one who stands to gain the most from my death isn't who you think it is. Trust no one. Ian's blood ran cold. The room seemed to close in around him. His instincts screamed the case wasn't over yet. Cliffhanger ending. Thomas, Ian whispered, his voice barely audible. What is this? But before Thomas could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. And then the lights flickered, the door to the drawing room slammed shut. Another twist, and this time Ian had no idea what awaited him. Ending cliffhanger, the legacy of Styles Manor. The storm had subsided, but the darkness outside felt deeper than before, as if the manor itself was holding its breath. Ian stood at the massive window of Styles Manor, looking out over the sprawling grounds, the estate's silhouette barely visible in the soft glow of the moonlight. His mind was racing. This case, the puzzle he had spent days solving, was finally over, or so it seemed. Behind him, the faint sound of whispers filtered through the cold, still air, but it wasn't just the wind. It was the house itself, the walls, the long corridors, the very foundation of Styles Manor that had lived and breathed with secrets for generations. He could almost hear the ghosts of the past pressing in on him, tugging at his mind. Had he truly uncovered everything, or was there more hidden, buried beneath layers of lies and forgotten truths? He took a slow, deliberate breath, running a hand through his hair as he turned toward the others. Alfred and Evelyn had been arrested, their fates sealed, but the unease in Ian's chest would not subside. He had solved the murder, but something gnawed at him, something more sinister lurking just beneath the surface. His eyes fell on the grand portrait hanging above the fireplace, a portrait of Emily, her eyes staring back at him, forever frozen in time. Did she know something he didn't? He wondered, his fingers brushing the edge of the mantel. She had been smart, clever, and she'd left behind a legacy, a final letter, and a warning that no one had yet fully understood. The mystery surrounding her death had been solved, but the true nature of her demise was still tangled up in the very bones of the manor. Was this part of something larger? Ian muttered to himself, almost as if he were testing the thought aloud. He stepped away from the window and moved toward the study, where the final letter had been found, the one that changed everything. He could still feel the weight of those words in his hands, the cryptic message Emily had left behind, suggesting that her death wasn't an isolated tragedy, but something tied to the very legacy of Styles Manor itself. The manor had stood for centuries, its halls filled with untold stories, generations of lives, power struggles, and secrets that had been buried deep in the shadows. Was Emily's death truly an act of passion and greed, or was it the culmination of a much larger, more sinister plot that had been set in motion long before she even arrived at Styles Manor? Ian paused in the doorway, his eyes locking on the tall grandfather clock in the corner. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. What if there was more to this? What if someone else, someone beyond the reach of justice, had been pulling the strings the entire time? He turned back to the room, his gaze shifting to the portraits of previous generations hanging on the walls, each one staring back, as if judging him, daring him to look deeper. It was as though the manor itself was a living, breathing entity, its past never truly letting go, its grip tightening as the truth unraveled. But as Ian stepped closer to the fireplace, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer beneath the edge of the rug, something he hadn't noticed before. With a mix of curiosity and dread, he knelt down, his fingers brushing against the worn fibers. Slowly, he pulled up the corner of the rug to reveal a hidden trapdoor, small, inconspicuous, and yet undeniably there. His heart skipped a beat. Had this been here all along? He stood up slowly, his mind whirling. A door to what? A secret room, a hidden passage, more evidence. The possibilities stretched out before him like an endless labyrinth. But one thing was clear. Styles Manor still had secrets it was refusing to relinquish. Ayan's hand hovered over the trapdoor's latch. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He could walk away. He could call it done, report the case closed, and let the authorities deal with what was left. But something inside him pulled him forward. The urge to know more was overpowering. The legacy of Styles Manor was far from finished, and deep down, he knew that opening this door would lead to something far darker than he could ever have imagined. He glanced back over his shoulder, his mind racing with the faces of everyone involved. Alfred and Evelyn were just the beginning. But who were the true architects of this nightmare? Was this murder only the first chapter of a much larger story? And what would he find on the other side of this door? He tightened his grip on the latch and pulled it open. But just as the door creaked, a sound echoed from the shadow's footsteps. Footsteps that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Ayan froze, his pulse quickened. And then the room went dark. Cliffhanger ending. The soft click of the door shutting echoed in the silence as Ayan's hand lingered on the trapdoor's handle. He turned quickly, his instincts screaming. There was someone else in the room with him. Someone who didn't want him to find the truth. A sharp breath caught in his throat as a shadow moved against the wall. "Detective," a voice whispered, low and dangerous. "You've made a grave mistake." The story, it seemed, was far from over. The story isn't oversubscribed to uncover the next shocking twist.